Hey everybody, thank you so much for the amazing introductions. I'm just honored to be able to be up here with this esteemed panel. You're going to see. I don't know if I can keep up with these guys, but these are some really heavy hitters here. Welcome to tonight's panel is called AI with Intent. Building futures that users love. Now, we picked this deliberately because 2025 really taught us a number of brutal lessons. By the end of last year, roughly 42% of companies had scrapped the majority of their AI initiatives. That's up from 17% the year before. That's not enthusiasm waning out. That is just an absolute failure and a crisis in execution. And we see this a lot with emerging technologies that are coming out, especially stuff like AI that just demos so well, then it implies capabilities that it doesn't actually have. And so the business people, run away with all of their grand ideas and start, planning on stuff that it can't necessarily even do. And it's our job to manage those expectations and figure all that stuff out. Here's an interesting kicker, and that is that the primary root cause of project failure has shifted. In 2024, it was technical limitations. It was the technology wasn't capable enough. But in 2025, it's leadership and process alignment, which means that the technology is now powerful enough. It's now working most of the time. But the question is whether or not we actually know what to do with it, and whether the business is set up to actually reap the benefits of it. Generative AI still orchestrates less than 1% of core enterprise processes. The industry's overall software implementation success rate is stagnant, around 25 to 30%. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not used to succeeding in only out of every 4 projects. That's not sustainable. And frankly, I'm surprised that it's even that high, because anecdotally, I see it more like 1 in 10. So tonight, we're not here to talk about what AI can do. We're here to talk about what it ought to do, or what we ought to do with it. And to make sure that your users, the people that are going to be using this stuff actually love it. So we've assembled 3 people who each represent kind of a different layer of this problem, deep expertise. And without further ado, I will introduce them. Our first panelist is Tesh Desai. He's the head of AI-driven virtual expert platform and product delivery at Intuit. Tesh runs the team delivering AI and human intelligence programs across TurboTax, QuickBooks, Credit Karma, and MailChimp, and he architects the virtual expert platform at Intuit. Tesh, welcome to the panel. Thanks a lot, man. Next, we have Áine Shivnan. She's the vice president of engineering at Qualcomm. Áine leads work on high-performance, low-power, on-device AI. Her world is kind of the operating system that makes intelligence personal, private, and instantaneous. So if your phone or your laptop does something smart without talking to the cloud, chances are her team had something to do with it. And finally, we have Ivan. Hang on, let me pull up my notes about Ivan Gonzalez. He represents ArkusNexus, our hosts here, and as Marco said, ArkusNexus is a consulting firm specializing in AI-powered software development. So Ivan basically lives in the implementation trenches. And he works with stakeholders who want AI somewhere in their organization, the kind of business leaders that you guys deal with all the time, and actual users who actually have to live with what ends up getting built. So his focus is on finding the first big win that earns trust. Ivan, thanks for joining us, man. Okay, let's dive right into it. The first section, I want to talk about the role of humans in AI and the role of AI in humans. Tesh, let's start with you. You highlighted with me when we were talking about this in the beginning. You highlighted the human intelligence aspect and being critical in building the right AI. You can't have a good AI model without the human collaborative aspect. So walk us through what that looks like in practice. How do you calibrate the human and the AI aspect together?
Great question to start, actually, especially because we're talking about AI and human intelligence and the mix of it. So what is AI, right? AI is, the main purpose of AI is efficiency. It really exists to make us more efficient, process large volumes of information, and derive conclusions in an independent manner. What does the human bring? The human brings nuance, empathy. These are characteristics that only humans have. AI does not have those. So if you take an example of, say, taxes, AI can go through thousands of lines of tax code, maybe tens of thousands, and God knows how many appendixes and all that. And it can find that one $2,000 deduction. However, whether to apply that deduction or not depends on a nuanced question that the AI then has to ask the human. Did you use your office primarily or your home as an office primarily for the rest of the full part of the year? And that question, only the human can answer. AI cannot determine that answer all by itself. It can try based on information it has, but it's probably going to struggle. So the idea is you want the AI to make the human, essentially superpower or empower the human with data and information and insights that then the human can apply their nuance and intelligence and empathy to interpret and apply. That's the idea. So that's kind of
we're not used to thinking about software this way. We're used to thinking about software is, I plug in a value in this Excel spreadsheet and then I get an answer in the lower end. And AI is not like that. AI is, it gives you a different answer every time. And you need to think about how you're using your systems differently, don't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would even tell you guys a simple example. If you haven't tried it, with Gemini or ChatGPT, ask it a question. It'll give you some data. Just say, are you sure? See what happens. Right? Because it's trying to react to the human, and the human is driving it nuts with the questions you're asking. And so we think that the AI is the problem, but it is just truly there to serve, but it's not the master, right? So that's the difference, right? When we talk about rule-based systems, it applies a rule. That rule was well considered for many years, and we know that 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah.
So when you give 2 and 2, it gives you 4. There's nothing, to me, there's nothing surprising about that, but
right.
AI does it differently, right?
Yeah. And remember, when ChatGPT first came out, 2 + 2 was giving you 6 or 10 or 12, right? And then they've managed to figure out how to get rid of that. But that actually kind of makes it worse because deep under the hood, it's not actually doing the same thing.
No, it's not thinking.
Yeah.
We think it's thinking, but that's why it's artificial intelligence, right? That's my kind of 2 cents.
No, I love that. Áine, we've discussed how the true value of AI lies not in the technology, but in actually how it enables the user, the time it saves for the user, the more powerful it makes the user, that sort of thing. With like AI-powered devices becoming sort of the baseline in 2026, you've got features like meeting summarization or real-time translation. These things are happening quietly in the background, so to speak, just with devices that we have sitting around on our table. How do you measure whether you've actually given someone their time back, or whether you've actually had a meaningful impact, or whether you've just given them another device to maintain and charge and keep connected and pay a $20 a month fee?
Well, you kind of said it there. You've spoken to what people would say is a KPI, how much time has been saved. But really, the measure should be around reduced cognitive load. And so you think back to Tesh's comment about the question that your tool will ask the human, about their home office. What if it doesn't take the right next step around that? Then the human said, well, did I answer that question in the right way? Now you have cognitive load.
You've just increased the cognitive load.
That's right. And it might have been simpler, to fill out the form and then, the rules-based things would take over. So I think this is where you need to bring that, we'll say, invisibility, that it's acting in a clear, understood and expected way, so that you're not surprised by the next step. The real-time translation becomes a significant thing right at the edge. Again, that's an important aspect to have. Do you need to go to the cloud? You might have translation that can translate hundreds of languages, but in your life, you probably only need 2 or 3.
Right.
So you can compress the application, get it smarter, and now you have instant response without having to send any of what you might feel you don't want to share outside of your own device. So now you've got reduced cognitive load about what information you've sent somewhere else. You don't have to ask where did that go. You have it here, and you've been able to take all of the tasks that you needed to do forward. So it's also not about feature adoption. We tend to talk about, I got this LLM and I'm doing this, and I've got now VLMs and all of that. To get to the point where you're talking about, I did these 3 things and it didn't even cost me. I didn't have to set up anything. The flow worked from the tools and the systems that are already on your PC, for example.
Yeah. I love this. That notion about AI is there to reduce your cognitive load. I love that concept. And the cognitive load is more than just the cognitive load of the specific task that you're asking the AI to do. I want it to do my taxes, for example. But it's also, as you mentioned, the surrounding cognitive load. Am I worried about the information I'm providing to the system? Is this LLM provider going to use this against me when it starts serving ads to me or whatever? Right? What do I have to worry about with that stuff? And that's a really, really great way to think about it.
Yes, and so many other things when you're having that localized control. Simple things like power, right? I'm hitting a data center and stuff. I'm doing it all here on my charged laptop. So
wow,
little plug there.
I love it.
Okay.
Ivan, you work with clients. I've done your job. I know exactly what this is like. And you work with clients that they just want you to put AI somewhere. Give me an .ai domain name, man. That's what we need. Because, that's how I need to get my next round of funding or whatever it is, right? I just need something that it's AI. And so you often find that you need to let stakeholders know that what they actually need is either IT transformation or automation or something different than AI. How do you manage that? How do you convey that without kind of deflating the room and getting their dauber down, so to speak, right? How do you steer people away from the AI sizzle, which is the wrong way to do things, towards genuine utility?
That's always a really interesting conversation that honestly I love to have with my potential customers, because they're always really excited about this new technology, right? Whether it's AI or back in the past it was a different technology, but it's what everybody was talking about. So first and foremost, you have to go and really understand the problem. It all boils down to what is the problem?
Yeah.
What do you need to solve? AI is a tool. It's a really powerful tool that it's out there, that is giving it to us, that can really solve amazing problems, but it's not the right tool for every problem. So you have to have that conversation. You have to talk with your customer. You have to talk with your stakeholder and really get them to talk to me about the problem. Yes, we'll do AI. Don't worry about it. We'll try AI eventually. But first, let's talk about the problem. Let's break it down. Let's see, first, do you have structured rules? Do you have a clear process? Your data structure? Probably AI is not the solution.
Yeah.
Probably we can do regular automation. Like we can do it. Are you talking about unstructured data? Okay, the conversation is leaning more towards AI. But yeah, it's going down to the basics. It's understanding the problem. It's as when you go into the computer and you open up ChatGPT, it's the same thing. You have to understand what you're going to be prompting the ChatGPT. So the conversation, I think it's moving away from AI everywhere to where does AI really provides value to the user.
Do you think that people are getting enough experience with the tools to where they can understand a little bit more about what it can do and what it can't do, so that are those conversations getting easier or harder?
That's a really interesting question as well, because I think we have two types of users, right? We have at least from the consulting aspect of it, you have the stakeholder users, and then you have your system users. You have some of the stakeholders. I have the CEO that says, I grab my Excel file, I throw it to ChatGPT, I ask him all the questions that I have, and he's bringing me great answers. Again, we're talking about a small POC.
Yeah.
We're talking about a small demo. It gets you really good results. But once you start scaling up into production level, that's where the conversations start getting heavy. And you go back to it. Okay, let's figure out the problem. Let's go back to the drawing board. What is your problem? Let's break it down to small steps and work with it. So yes, I think the users are getting more experience within the tool and the technology, but you as a consultant still have to go to the basics, right? It's another tool. It's another tool to solve a problem, but we have to go right first and analyze the problem.
There's this great episode of an old sitcom called Cheers. And what happens in the episode is the bartender who owns the bar, this guy Sam, he has to fire their piano player in the bar. And just he's a drunk or something, I don't remember the specific reason. And it turns out that his backup bartender, Woody, played by Woody Harrelson, he says, oh, I can play the piano. And Sam's like, really? And so he sits down on the piano and he starts banging away and he plays this beautiful sonata. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. And Sam is blown away. And so he fires the piano player and he's like, Woody, you're the new guy. And everybody's all excited. And then so Sam goes, okay, let's, the people are coming in, go ahead and play again. And he plays the exact same song. And then, okay, that's fine. It's the same song. These people weren't here before. So now, okay, play something else. And Woody's like, I mean, I can't. That's the only song I can play. And Sam's like, what are you talking about? He goes, yeah, I spent 2 years stranded on this island and with a player piano. And that's how I learned to play. And so I only have one song. And that's kind of the way AI pilots work, right? It can do this thing, but the instant you want to kind of scale it up to the rest of the audience, that's you're kind of screwed.
Completely agree with that. And you see it, honestly, you see it all the time. It's really fast to throw something together and get quick answers.
That's the challenge with
That's
AI.
the challenge, right? But again, go back to the basics, problem solving. And I think that's what we rely on.
I love it. Áine, let's talk about Edge AI. That's where you are just an absolute expert now. And so this, correct me if my understanding is wrong, this is processing on the device instead of the cloud. So I don't have to send my data out into the ether to go figure out. That reduces, solves for latency, it solves for privacy and connectivity all at once. If I'm in, middle of an oil field, maybe I don't have connectivity, that sort of thing. In real terms, with connectivity getting better and better, with privacy, I don't know, maybe do people care about that? With our, in real terms, how much does that matter to the user and in what circumstances and that sort of thing?
So at Qualcomm, the word latency has been something we've talked about since our inception, obviously for network performance and so on. But when it comes again to the human-centered experience, it doesn't take much for the interaction to feel unnatural. And so you move from what's, let's say, conversational to something that is transactional, which is also very, very useful, but it's a barrier to making the AI invisible. So the latency and what you need to do locally, that's very helpful. Again, making things small. You can, from a hybrid AI perspective is what we call it. You can split tasks up and already know from a context perspective what may need to go to the cloud, can work in the background while you're engaging the user, with some of the initial information that could be contextual about the data you have on your phone. So maybe your own photographs, your own calendar, all of that kind of thing. So this is where latency becomes, today's topic as well as our topic throughout our history. And when you think about, physical AI, right, robotics and that, where decisions and responses and reasoning need to happen, fairly quickly, that becomes an important aspect as well. And of course, we talk a lot about AI now in the context. Generative AI is the hot thing, right?
Right.
Conventional AI has been around for quite some time.
60 years.
Exactly. And with deep neural networks, right, we had some very interesting developments over the past decade. Camera, some fantastic, shots now that you can take on your phone that, 10 years ago you had to be exactly a professional photographer for. And it's doing that before you ever take the shot. Right, so it's not post-processing, things like that. So again, is that a latency topic? Not so much, but it gets you a much better experience, and now you ship the photo off to somewhere.
Yeah, I guess there's always a line, right? I mean, even as connectivity gets better and latency gets lower, there will always be stuff that you're going to want to do locally.
Yes.
Balancing a robot.
Yes.
Will never be done.
Exactly, 100%. But then that robot will have to determine, what environment is it operating in? Where is the human I'm assisting? How are they doing? And how do I interact with that human to keep it safe or do a task?
Yeah.
And even simpler when we think about all the devices that you might have, glasses, phones, PC, earbuds. We're going to see AI happening in all of those that gets orchestrated among those devices in a low latency, low power way that then you only have to send so much up to the cloud for bigger decisions and longer context.
Yeah, interesting. I love that. Tesh, Intuit has the opposite kind of value prop, right? You're training financial models across millions of users and to find patterns, right? This, obviously, you can't do that without aggregated cloud data, and latency isn't as much as an issue for you. How do you see the tension between Aine's version of keeping everything or as much as possible on the device and your need for just this massive data, this massive amount of data?
I really like this question because, to me, the cloud and the edge are not, it's not a versus, they're not competitors.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's kind of what Áine is also talking about, that they really are complementary, right? And it really depends on the use case that you're trying to achieve. And so, what is the cloud good for? What is the device good for? If I'm trying to get a document from a user for tax purposes, I could scan their W-2 on their device, pull the data using a localized model on their device, get the user to review the data, and then submit that data when they're satisfied. And that data then goes to the cloud and it gets processed against all the proprietary information that we probably don't want to send, and vice versa. Maybe the client we don't really need to get their W-2 actually physically, we just want their information. And now if you take the cloud on the other hand, let's say I'm trying to give a small business owner, something that says your cash flow is 20% lower than other HVAC providers in your zip code. Mm-hmm. There is no way I'm doing that on the device. Mm-hmm. It needs, petabytes of data on the cloud, lots of processing across lots of different crowd, the crowd of HVAC service providers or other businesses to provide that kind of incisive insight to a person, and maybe even follow up with what they can do to improve on it, right? And to improve their cash flow, right? And so that's how, to me, it's, and I think you said it, pattern, right? So you want to find the patterns among the large volumes of data, and then you want to apply it locally to the individual in a private setting.
Yeah, I love that. Ivan, now, when you are engaging with a client, you're mapping how work actually gets done across a client's organizations. How much does that physical location of the intelligence, how do you figure out what you're going to leave on the edge and what you're going to take to the cloud? How do you deal with the latency and and the privacy and those sorts of concerns?
Yeah, I think this conversation comes more definitely with enterprise client than the other small and medium enterprises. Businesses. But with enterprise clients, you got the healthcare sector, the financial sector, where the data kind of dictates or tells you the decision. You have to keep your data privacy, right? So you have to, you can't engage with like we were discussing previous to the panel, with Gemini enterprise engagements or Claude enterprise engagements where they get you your private cloud network. So you can opt through that solution as well. So when you're figuring out your solution, your strategy on your AI solution, you go that through the client, right? Are you comfortable with going with this enterprise level relationship with some of the AI providers, or you're more comfortable with running things locally? So you end up kind of agreeing with Tesh in terms with a hybrid approach. Sensitive data, you can split it up, you can figure out your algorithms, you can figure out your solution, your workflows to process sensitive data on-prem or in private clouds. And the rest of the things, you can send it over to the cloud, right? And even going back to the original question, do we ever have to, for the problem that you're addressing, do we have to do AI with this? Do we have to send it over to the cloud? Can we do it just with automation, with just regular ETLs, data pipelines? Sometimes the conversation revolves around that. But again, you have different solutions, and the strategy does change when you're talking about sensitive data. And I also just want to add as well is that user adoption also changes when you're explicitly telling them that you're keeping your data or the information that you're working on privately.
Sure.
So also
it goes back to the cognitive
that.
load Áine was talking about.
Exactly. So that's also another important thing to keep in mind on your strategy.
Yeah, please.
And this is something I always, think about, right? And I don't know how some of the people may be younger, but there was something called client server, right? So client server and edge and cloud aren't really all that different, right? Just there was a mainframe, this is not mainframe, this is some other, contraption, right? But I think we just have to go back to what we did back then for inspiration, right? Google has been downloading maps onto your phone for, I don't know, how long? I don't know. I can't even remember now, but at least 15 years that I know of, right? And so you get a local map. You don't need to be on the network anymore. It's doing all the GPS positioning, everything as you're driving in the absence of a network signal, right? So it's not that, novel in the AI space, technically, right? I guess in my head.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun in that respect. Everything rhymes with how, you've got a client mainframe and then it gets onto your desk and then it gets onto your phone, but then now we're accessing the new mainframe. Ivan, you said something that really resonated with me a while back, and you said that the companies often try to automate broken processes. And when that happens, all AI is doing is accelerating existing inefficiencies, right? Or kind of hiding them away. Why? Explain to us how that process works in diagnosing inefficient workflows. Why is that so much more important than the conversation everybody wants to have, which is, which LLM are we going to pick?
Yeah, I agree. Again, going back, we have clients that say, I want to use the Claude model because I want the 1 million context. It's the best one. I just want it. And it's going back to, okay, I understand. Yes, definitely. There's really great models out there. They're going to do great things for you. But let's go back to your process. Let's go back to your workflows. The good thing that you have with these new tools is that you can iterate on your hypothesis, on your tests really fast, and you can evaluate really fast. So we spend a lot of time on the discovery phase and leveraging all these tools. You can prototype faster. You can say, hey, you can do projections real fast and say, are we doing this the right way? Again, looking at your workflows, looking at your processes, mapping it out, throwing prototyping really quick. But again, you're still in the discovery phase. Is LLM the answer for this problem that you have? So we leverage that. We spend more time. Again, going back, it's like you're using ChatGPT or you're using Gemini or you're using Claude. You're just doing the prep. You always say when you're developing, work on your requirements, work on your process, work on your plan, work on your plan, work on your plan. When you're set, you're good to go. It's the same thing where you're figuring out a solution for a customer, for your client. Work on your discovery. Work on how you're going to do it. Once you feel good, you go out and implement it.
Okay, so then let's talk, and this is going to be a question for everybody, but I'll start with you, Ivan. Let's talk about the economics of AI implementation. And that obviously is first and foremost in the conversation you end up having with clients because they're writing a check for it, right? Yep. It's a little bit different if it's an internal initiative, but the same rationale applies. How do you get buy-in for the analysis that needs to happen? My guess is that everybody's got this bias towards action. Let's just build it and be legends, right? But you got to kind of sit them down and explain the ROI and make sure that return and that they're able to capture that return, or else the entire initiative is just going to get cumbersome. It's going to get shut down. How do you invite that part of the discussion?
Definitely, it's a conversation that has to happen, and you're correct. You have to figure out the ROI. But we look at it, we break it down in three ways. We have your build cost. The build cost is basically your engineering implementation, your training of the model, your integration. That is your build cost to implement an AI. Then you have your run cost, right? You're talking with your providers, your APIs. APIs token usage builds up really, really, really fast.
Yeah,
so you have to convey that. So you're talking, again, build, run, and then you have replacement cost. It's another thing that we like to put into our customers because new models come in every month, every couple of weeks, every 3 weeks. So you might build a strategy, but you have to figure out if your strategy, how much does it cost if you have to pivot from that strategy that you put together, right? Or how do you decouple the thing correctly? So we always kind of put together those three things: build, run, and replacement costs. So our stakeholders really understand what's the true cost of running AI, right? And at the end, you throw in your ROI. Is how much is this saving times for your direct users? How much it's providing new value to your potential customers or your organizations? But you have to be transparent about the three costs that it actually takes to run and implement an AI solution.
Do you find that the customers are really good at, are they good at capturing that benefit? Or is that something that you have to get them to focus on too?
No, it's definitely something that you have to get to focus. Like, for example, if you're doing an automation for a customer service, you have to talk in their terms, right? So it's the amount of customer service calls that it's going to kind of replace. And this is what you're saving. So you have to show it in their terms, in their knowledge, so they can really understand. They don't understand. Well, some of the advanced users, they understand API usage and all that. They understand tokens. Tokens is kind of complex element to convey to stakeholders, but you have to explain them. AI is not a magic box that it will always work out. It has its costs, right? So you have to put them in their terms and how that relates back to their business process.
Makes sense. Áine, what do you think about? How do you deal with the economics in a bigger company?
So we, from a customer perspective, one of the areas that we're really developing in is industrial IoT. And so this is not maybe our internal use example, but there's, you're thinking about, IT setups, right, where you're trying to run a system or a field of operations. And what I'm seeing more and more is this term operational technology. And what can you put down, at a particular site where you might have, security cameras or robots and monitoring systems that can be done there. And then what of that needs to be in this hybrid situation going. So, going back to Ivan's point about, what in the old days we would call systems analysis, right? And we would deep dive and break it down, and you would find some of these problematic spaces. Well, let's not put AI on that because actually it's a broken system process, and you break it out. And so some of these opportunities can be pushed down what we call the edge in industrial IT, and then leave the system big issues that a plant may need to make up at the system. So those are potential cost savings where you can deploy new technology to enable our customers to think about a new way of deploying a plant or a series of plants that are all interconnected. Internally, obviously, we're an engineering company, so we're looking at all the tools and picking the right one, of course.
That makes sense. Tesh, what do you? You've got kind of. Many of your initiatives are going to be internal initiatives, or they're going to be like trying to figure out how to leverage this stuff to get your clients to get the most benefit, so that they become sticky, so that they continue to use your services. How do you deal with the economics of the issue and the fuzziness around whether or not there's a return at all?
Yeah, I think this is a very, tricky question, and it's definitely, not easy to answer any of the cost questions. But I think, the way we look at it is, that, you really understand the true value of AI when you go from cost per token in your thinking to value per decision. Right? Because if you think about the business rules-based system, and I know, there's always a tendency to glorify the past. Each business rule required specific coding, testing, deployment. It was one rule, one set of rules. And AI, the problem really with AI is that the base infrastructure is brand new. Never, it wasn't there before. And so there's a startup cost, very different from what was there before. And that is unfortunately something people have to bear. Yes, there is a cost to upgrade models, but it's nowhere near the cost of switching from, let's take C to C++, or from COBOL to, whatever flavor of language you wanted. That was an entire rewrite. So, if you would look at, conventional technology, we would be looking at, there's a 5-year obsolescence or 3 years. So when you do total cost of ownership, you basically depreciate that asset down to zero. So that technology, conventional technology, rules-based, whatever you want to call it, technology is a depreciating asset versus AI is, ultimately the cloud, that's somebody else's problem. I could outsource that to somebody and I'm paying per use, which means I'm not actually taking on all that. Yes, the cost is high today, but I need to find the justification for it in terms of the value I'm driving for the business. And that's the decisions that we need to be making. And remember, the AI model, once you actually get it right, it does decisions autonomously, right? Now, getting it right is not trivial, and we should probably talk about it. But it's, but the point is, you do have to, get it right, and then it gives you enormous value versus the business rules.
Well, that actually segues into my next question, which is, how do you get it right? In fintech, a hallucination isn't just some kind of quirky mistake, right? This is the difference between owing penalties for not getting your taxes in, or having it be an actual good return, right? How do you balance that?
And so, I totally, absolutely love this one because I think there's 3 parts to this, right? There is the and again, you'll hear this multiple times from multiple sources, and so you get immune to it, but it remains true. The first part, which is real, accurate data. There is not a single day when and I'm sure Ivan goes into a client and they're always talking. There's always conversation of what is the golden data set on which I'm training my model, because you cannot have a model trained on crappy data that's going to give you outcomes that resonate with you. And so you need good data, and good data is not just data that is fully spelled out or fully populated, because that's or clean data. That's not the idea. It's way more than that. It's what is the condition, what is the outcome, right? An example we use very frequently in taxes is, can I deduct my dog as an expense? Or as a dependent, right? And no, you cannot deduct your dog as a dependent. However, in California, you can deduct some pet expenses, right? That's the real answer, but I would not know that. I'm not a tax expert, right? But somebody knows that answer, and I need to get that into data so that the model can learn from it.
Man, chicken's going to start pulling his weight.
Right, so that's... So number one is that, right? Real accurate data. Then the second part is the techniques of model training. So RAG, again, I don't know how many people know that, but augmented generation of results and predictions. And that's just one. There's so many different techniques, and you don't want to go blindly into every one of them, but that techniques are important. Things like business-specific models. So we have financial models. I'm sure you can read about it, freely on the internet. And we also have an underlying framework that we leverage for accuracy and consistency and so on. And those things are things you do have to invest in to get that. And then the final ingredient is the human, right? Remember we said AI plus HI. And so the human intelligence part is in two. So remember, the human's on 2 sides. And I think we've talked about this before, but the human is your customer and the human is also your expert. So the expert doesn't, it's whoever in your business knows your business. Could be you, right? If you're a small business. And so the customer, imagine I'm doing, like the W2 example, I interpreted your W2, got some data. You should offer it back to the customer to verify. That verification is basically a reinforcement learning event that you need to feed back into the model.
Yeah.
So that you learn from it. Now, we may not do that, and then we've lost that opportunity, right? And then on the back end where the expert sits, whoever that expert is, whatever the business is, they should be looking at the predictions on the insight side of the house, which is, hey, your tax refund is XYZ, then, that in the tax world, but hey, it could be, a doctor with, you have glaucoma or you don't, and somebody should look at it and say, is this true or is this false? And why, and what happened. And again, another feedback event at that point, which is a training opportunity for your model and an opportunity to further augment that golden data set that you have. So all these three things, when put together, is what gets you to your, that lack of hallucinations or elimination of them. And it doesn't happen overnight. So, if you imagine you're going to fix it, like I'm going to create a model in that, rudimentary example and then scale it, that's where the problems start.
Yeah, and then, but, like Ivan has got to deal with this all the time because, again, business people are used to being able to write a check and then they have a system that does X, Y, and Z, right? You install SAP and then your invoices are now on the computer. Whereas, if you're doing this stuff, it doesn't work that way. And so you've got to set the expectations properly. You can't let them kill off thinking that on day one they're going to have the system and it's going to work magically. It's going to take some time. If you're not doing that, you're done for.
Yeah, it's a real investment, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing, the whole ecosystem is an investment,
Yeah.
right? It's not magical.
Áine, so we mentioned earlier, I made a joke earlier about how nobody cares about privacy. And I actually, I think that is kind of true, but I also think that there's a reckoning coming in there where we're going to realize that we care a lot more about it than we have been. Give me a sense, do you think that that the way that we're building trust with these providers and these systems, when you know that it's going to be private, it builds a different kind of trust. Do you think that's something that users actually feel that difference, or is that not something that matters yet?
So that's a very, I guess a personal question. Everybody maybe has different thoughts around that. But I think in general, it's the question about, is my data protected or have I needed to send it anywhere? And I guess there is a sense, well, if I didn't send it anywhere, then I'm in good shape. Yeah. Now, do we know what's been sent anywhere, right? There's a lot of information that you're just giving to cloud providers just by your interaction with their apps and stuff. But when it comes to things like your finances and that, if it never leaves the system, then you're not relying on data protection. So I think there's you step maybe down a level of anxiety and maybe slightly up with trust.
Yeah, reduces the cognitive load you were talking about.
Exactly. And so, those are the things that can maybe invisibly grow over time after you've shown that. You mentioned in one of your questions about, your biometrics and getting, that controls your access into your system. Mm-hmm. That's been a nice step forward, to avoid multi-factor authentication was one of my, it's just painful. And it's like, I left my phone upstairs or actually that number goes to my husband's email. It's like, Call him, can you give me the code? Yeah. Which is not very secure apparently, but
right,
there you
it's
go.
Almost worse.
It's almost worse. Yeah. So I think these are the kinds of things, from a hardware perspective that will build some trust, and I think there's opportunities for us to do more there.
Yeah. Ivan, tell me about how you rescue failing projects. Give me, to what extent how do you deal with that? And how do you, what are some intentional design choices you can make on the front end or what are some things that you need to do to make sure that you keep in mind in order to rescue failing AI projects?
I think with AI, one of the things that really helps out the adoption of the user in order to prevent rescuing the project is to provide as much as you can the visibility of what is happening within this black box, this black magic box that it's going on, right? And obviously you need the, design and spend some time on the UI, depends on the problem and the application that you're building. But as much as you can provide the confidence of the AI, of the model, of what you did out to the user, they feel more in control of what is going on. And also, if you can provide them with an escape hatchet, a way that they can say, this is wrong, I'm gonna edit this. This is not what I'm trying to do. But if you provide them the ability to de-risk the action that they are doing, that is where you're trying to get that back control to them. Because in our engagements, sometimes they're using the business application, the system, the internal applications, they are being used to use the AI application, right? And the first thing they take doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't give them the answer. So as you become more transparent on what's going on behind the scenes, that's when you're getting more adoption.
Got it. All right, here's a question for everybody. Is AI, do you go wide or do you go deep, right? Is AI with intent about doing more stuff for the user, or is it about doing fewer things but really, really well? Ivan, what do you think?
I think definitely it's doing less things, but really well, as well as you can do it. I think the conversation is shifting more on where does AI really provides value to your user, to your stakeholder. And that is the reason that it's an efficient tool, but you have to revolve the conversations on value. You have to go back. I'm gonna keep saying it's going back to the basics. It's breaking down the problems into smaller chunks and grabbing that little thing that provides 10 times value instead of 10% or 20% improvement. You have to have the conversation around value. That is the reason that I think it's doing less with more.
Definitely. Áine, what do you think?
So yes, I very similar to Ivan, but if we take it to the device, right? If we go back 10, 15 years, we would never have thought we would be using devices in the same way that we are today. I mean, they're packed full of sensors, amazing amounts of information about us as we, move through the world. Let's think about, the safety that has been enabled in vehicles and systems as a result. So I think as we, as AI gets more dependable, reliable, I think more and more opportunities for new things that we haven't thought about will just naturally come. And when we can do those at, lower cost and in a way that us as humans can control how they're done through things we understand, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Tesh?
I think just maybe, to me, it's about, AI is about doing less of the things that add the least value. And so very similar to what both Áine and I'm losing my train of thought now. But the idea, I think, is, think about, a small business owner or any business owner. Are they really looking for 50 new reports that are incredibly accurate? I think the answer we all know is no.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. No, I need one report that just tells me, show me a green screen when my business is doing awesome and show me a yellow screen when it's
So
not.
you're really looking for a handful of very precise, helpful, actionable insights.
Yeah.
That's what AI should be used for, right?
Yeah.
It's not about, let's do lots of things and then, end up with a bunch of confusing insights for somebody who then now has to cognitive overload of, okay, what do I do with this, right? It has to be, here's a few insights. Example I gave earlier of, hey, your cash flow is 20% lower than people like you. And you can do the following 4 things to change that.
Yeah, I think
that
that's
would be
amazingly
extremely powerful.
Yeah. Do you think, if you look into 2027 and beyond, do you think that human in the loop is always going to be the gold standard in terms of financial services, or do you think that we're going to lean towards more fully autonomous financial management?
That's a phenomenal question. I think So my thought is that we'll be more human on the loop versus human in the loop in the coming years. Would it be 2027? I hope so. But for sure, AI will be doing a lot of autonomous tasks for you. So AI may pay your bills. AI may, optimize the interest you make in your investment accounts through moving money around. But the decisions and the policies that are set are not set by AI. Those are set by humans. And so it's not about, really taking the human out of the loop or, putting the human out of work. It's about moving the human into those more policy-making, situations or decisions or decision-making, situations. And, leveraging that empathy, that context that the human has, and the essential power of decision making that a human has, and having the AI provide the insights for them to make those decisions and set those policies.
Áine, as AI becomes more and more invisible, so it fades into the background, how do we make sure that users still have the awareness and agency over what their devices are doing?
So I think you have to maintain the ability for the human to have agency, right? We talk a lot about agents, but the human agent needs to be there. And there's AI and HI. They need to continue engaging. And the reasons for much of what we're doing in AI is to serve the human needs, either reducing cognitive load, allowing that to go elsewhere, or improving their life experience. And so we need that agency, that sense of control, the ability to intervene, as Ivan was saying, and it may change how we do things, how we validate, the testing and validation before deployment. How do we measure reliability? Today, it's about a fast response. How quickly did that work? How many tokens? But if I run it 10,000 times, am I going to get the same response? What's the mean time between failure? And particularly for things like physical AI, that's going to be extremely important. So the ability to intervene and keeping the human centered as the receiver of that service.
Got it. Ivan, there's this concept that has been floating around called AI detox. And this concept that developers who use AI-assisted coding tools are losing their ability to actually solve problems the way that you and I had to learn to code, right? Is this just like old man get off my lawn stuff, or is this a real thing? And or is coding going to go the way of standard transmissions in cars?
Well, I think there's definitely a concern there, but one thing that we're seeing with our teams is that people are getting really good at asking what they want, engineers, and verifying the output. And I believe that this is a new skill that people are bringing into their tool belt. So I agree that there's a concern. You still have to have the humans being able to understand what the AI is throwing at you. So you have to have engineers that understand every line of code that is not written by them. You have to have, you obviously know that good engineers are the ones that have good system design, architecture knowledge, that they can understand security vulnerabilities in the code. They can debug code that is not their own. So we encourage that to continue to happen within our teams. But I see that there's definitely a different way that entry-level developers are getting into for what we had back in the day. There's definitely that. But look at it this way. I was discussing with a colleague. It's like you're in math class, right? And they're not asking you to solve complex division problems without a calculator, right? You still have to understand how a division works and explain that. I think it's the same way. So there's some concern. I don't think we're losing problem-solving skills. I think we're adding more skills into our tool belt.
I like that sentiment. That's a good metaphor. All right, Áine and Tesh, I'm going to ask you guys for one final piece of advice. I'm going to give you 60 seconds, just a riff. Give me one good piece of advice for CTOs who are trying to build a culture transparency and getting AI to yield real actual results?
I think it's about restraint and understanding your boundaries and knowing where to apply them, not fixing the wrong problems, right? You're the one that understands your business context. Take that to the AI, problem solvers like Ivan. I think people find themselves using AI to do work that they never get to. Maybe there's a reason you never get to it. It's not, critical to the business. So, there's time to spend in the playground, but, let's put some restraint and critical boundaries around the decision-making before you dive in.
That's great advice.
Maybe I'll just say three things. I think one, don't forget software development lifecycle. Right?
Yeah.
Don't forget you have to find the right use cases. And third, don't forget the human, because it is AI plus HI. It doesn't exist on its own.
Yeah. Oh, I love that sentiment. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. And thank you guys all out here. Let's get a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.
Sitting through everything.
Also, a round of applause to our moderator, Shaun. He's a fellow CTO Talks community, so when we asked him to do this, he said, yeah. So that's really great. We have time for 4 questions, so anyone wants to ask some? Okay, I'll go with you guys.
Hi, Ryan here. From a cybersecurity perspective, what are the 3 biggest enterprise challenges with AI that I can't find on an online article?
I think, so I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I think, we talked about some of the confidentiality challenges before when you upload information. So this concept of, hey, everybody's going to try AI, let me just, people can just randomly use. So we have, for example, we do not allow the public version of Gemini to be used within our environment, right? Because we had to lock it down. It is the controlled environment because we do have people using tax data and all kinds of stuff. So we have to control that. So some of those kind of, what goes out does go out. I think Áine was talking about earlier. I think anything else that we talk about with security, this is still data exchange. This is not something that is, something newfangled. It's still data, bits going over wire. Or cloud, whatever you want to call it, Wi-Fi, and so it is all still applicable, right? Maybe you don't have the exact same SQL injection attacks from before, but you can do damage through that. And then, of course, if you go down the whole security rabbit hole, if somebody builds an agent that is malicious and starts to attack your company, what would you do? Would you build an agent back? And if these 2 agents are fighting each other, who wins in the end? I mean, there's all kinds of crazy scenarios that exist. But, again, I'm not an expert in that space, but this is some of the things that I know.
This is not something from our enterprise, but very interesting that you see with the coding capabilities of these models. The bounties that have been handed out for folks to find vulnerabilities. That's changing that whole model, and I suspect you're in cybersecurity. I'd love to hear from you what's going to be the new focus there.
Again, no cybersecurity experience here. Sorry, I'll miss on that. But
Right, you're the next panel.
Yeah. but I would say really understand the approach that you're using or the provider that you're using. Just don't go with what it's recommended. Do your due diligence. Get references on other companies or other CTOs or other tech leaders that have used X thing, and try to do your due diligence and not just don't go whatever ChatGPT recommends. That's what I would say.
Hi, my name is Yan. I would love to learn from an enterprise perspective how you're preparing for autonomous agents, working with agents on platforms, and how you're dealing with the security on that, specifically OpenClaw.
So agents working with agents is such a an interesting and it's such a deep topic. I mean, so just, maybe a few things that come to mind instantly. Agents, working with agents, there's authentication challenges across, that entire ecosystem. There's authorization challenges because if I have asked for something, does that mean the agent automatically has the rights to all the data I do? Did I give rights to the agent to do, to access certain kinds of data, and now I'm using that agent, therefore I inherit all those rights? So these are all questions that need to be solved. They're not trivial, and they need to be well thought out. I would point even to a whole other side of it that, there's this perception that things will remain the way they are, but hopefully everybody realizes that today, as a user, I have access to a tool, and tomorrow, if I have 15 of these agents and they're all accessing the tool, that probably is 15 licenses, which is different cost structure, right? Because obviously companies are learning and they're not going to sell, the same model. I think Microsoft is already changing the licensing and so are the companies. And so I don't know if that gives you a little bit of flavor of where this could, be, the kind of things you have to think about when you talk about agents, right? And then obviously, companies like ours, we do have and we do build our own foundational frameworks for how these agents will exist and coexist. Because it's, when a customer comes in, they're not expecting to have to pick 15, from 15 agents as to what to do. They're expecting to accomplish a task. And that task must be enabled on the inside with some combination of agents, right? I want my agent to pay a bill, check if I have an account, enough money in my account, do this, do that. And that could be an entire workflow, which a totally different agent might orchestrate, which then has to call all these different agents one by one. And each of those has to work. Now, it sounds like an API, but it's a lot more complicated than that because obviously, there's all the security pieces to it, as you mentioned. So I don't know if that gives you a bit of a, if anybody wants to try,
No, I've got nothing.
Well, I agree with Tesh, but something that that I can add, it's prepare with observability. Like always have a clear understanding of what everything is doing. And that's an approach that we always take. It's first, we tackle the observability and then you plug in your agents, you plug in your elements. So that's really key. Always have control, always have the human element. They can do the work, but you have to supervise it.
AI depends on data. The better the data, the better the AI. What are your recommendations for best practices with preparing corporate data from all corporate applications and creating like a unique knowledge graph? What are some of the best practices for that? And has, like, for example, Intuit and Qualcomm done something like that?
I can quickly add in terms of the consulting side of aspect, because it's one of the things that we always do when we first engage a client. There's this kind of an urgency to start with AI and figuring out the AI solution first. But just like you mentioned, you have to work first on the foundation. You have to work on your data structure. You have to figure out your pipelines. You have to figure out where the information is coming, how clean it is, how structured it is. So I would even say that that is more than 50% of the project of the solution coming in. If you don't have your data in an organized manner, if you don't understand your data, you cannot pass it to the AI or to the agents and do the work. So yes, unfortunately, it's a boring piece. It's a boring phase, but it is a critical phase that you have to employ. And definitely there's mechanisms, there's frameworks, there's methodologies that you can do. You have to bring in your data scientists. It all depends on how complex is the problem, but you have to clean up the data. I will say that it's the first step in order to provide an AI solution.
So you talk about having clean data from your business processes, but from an automotive ADAS perspective, we've done a lot of data collection. You may have seen Qualcomm cars around the space, but we don't want perfect data, right, for that kind of a solution. But we need lots and lots and lots, and we also look at synthetic data as well for certain things. So it's a different problem. and a different data capture for each business solution you're trying to come up with. But the control and the categorization and labeling of all of that is probably a similar problem across, and then making it easy for people to use your training pipeline, your fine tuning, all of that kind of thing is probably a similar challenge for both.
And I think these are all valid for almost any environment. The only other thing I would probably offer is, I think I said earlier, think about, the user in the front and the expert at the back, and the learning opportunity when the user in the front is asking something, you gave them something that you thought delivered what they were expecting, and they say this is incorrect, here's why, whatever. And it's a learning opportunity, and that essentially should be fed back into your golden data set or your data as a valid situation that must be addressed. And so if you think about that entire example, there has to be some sort of, if you go back, way back when Google first, started identifying cats in pictures, right? Somebody had to give it a bunch of pictures and had to go through that. And so and then the human was looking at that and at the answers it had come up with, and telling it whether it was right or wrong. So the whole reinforcement learning kind of paradigm, which has to be, that has to happen, right? So which has to happen at the user side, which is your customer, and on the expert side, which is your internal expert that says this is not a valid answer, right? Can I do this? Can I offer? Can I deduct my dog as a dependent, right? That kind of expertise needs to be encoded in the data beyond all the cleaning and moving and all that. So I would say you basically are perpetually living in this, right? It never ends because the use cases never end.
I run a small law firm, and we are developing an AI intake process. So it's going to be voice and data, whatever. Every company in the world wants to supply this to us now. Like every phone company, every technology company, everyone is now an AI supplier. And the model for most of those companies is they'll develop it, and then they will own it, and they will charge us a cost per minute, usually, sometimes a cost per call. Normally, like traditionally, my preference would have been to pay for the development and own it. But given the software development life cycle, I think, I don't know, like a year or 2 years from now, that's probably going to be almost free and ubiquitous. And so I can't think about it the same way that I would normally have thought about technology. So I'm just wondering, how do I make a decision in terms of vendor, and in terms of the model, and in terms of what ownership I'm going to have, if in 2 years from now it's going to look like a different world?
Yeah.
Thanks. I have some thoughts about this.
You want to try?
Yeah. This is a thorny problem. And here's the thing. In order to actually keep that system running, you need to be a development shop, or you need to hire one. And those are your two options. If you have the in-house talent to be able to stand this stuff up and keep it running, and it goes back to what Ivan was saying about you have a cost of build, and you have a cost of run, and you have a cost of rebuild when the new version of whatever GPT comes out. And it changes every 6 months. It might as well be a new platform. The capabilities are so much better. So what you're hoping is that whatever vendor you select is going to be able to keep up with that. They're going to be aggregating a bunch of different clients that have the exact same problem, and they're going to get some economies of scale on that you'll never achieve. So your cost of doing that is going to be so much higher that you're better off just picking a vendor. Now, the bad side about that is now this vendor can hold you hostage. And so you've got, and by the way, your stuff is going to be able to use to train all their stuff, and it's going to be used to train their developers and everything. Then they're going to go implement the exact same thing for your competitors too. And so you've got to decide, is this a core competency that we need to have? And if it is, then you need to do it yourself and you need to own it. And if it's not a core competency you need to have, which in your case, your core competency is being lawyers. So I would have a bias towards buy versus build in that circumstance, unless I just had some really, really crack development team that could do that. But you guys are lawyers. You can figure out how to make sure that you can't be held hostage, I would think. Anybody else have anything to say about that?
Maybe
Yeah.
just one thing I would add is I think that also you want to think about what is the number one use case you want to do versus I want to do all of these things. Because also we also sometimes use vendors, and similar to your situation, not exactly, but we are a software company. We want to build our own platform. We don't really want to be held hostage for sure, and we have really good lawyers. But so still we worry about that because it does create problems. So I think you do have to think about what is the number one use case you're really trying to solve. Because I know you said a few things, I still didn't understand what the use case was, and that probably is my number one red flag for you, that you're looking at vendors and solutions, but I don't know what your use case is. And if you can't articulate that in 2 or 3 sentences, like we have what we call a D for D, so design for delight kind of a process at Intuit. And what we do is we say, okay, I am a so-and-so, and here's what I'm trying to solve. And if you can't say it in 3 or 4 sentences, then you really are not ready. I think that's kind of what my thing would be, that you're like, okay, I want to get on the bandwagon, but what is it that you want to really achieve, right?
A round of applause, please, to our panelists and moderator.